Mark mera dosta, mera acha dosta. He was never an armchair journalist, so he always tried to get to where the story is. You know, quite a lot of journalists do their journalism on the phone or now by online. He always wanted to be where the story was. He cared about India. He didn't just know about India, he was invested in India.
नमस्कार दोस्तों, आप जानते हैं कि भारत में बीबीसी के मशहूर पत्रकार रहे मार्क टुली का निधन हो गया है। वो अब हमारे बीच में नहीं हैं और बड़ी शिद्दत के साथ लोग मार्क टुली को याद कर रहे हैं, चाहे वो जर्नलिस्ट हों, चाहे पॉलिटिशियंस हों और चाहे आम आदमी हों। और मार्क टुली के साथ जिन लोगों ने काम किया, वो खास करके उनको बहुत ही श्रद्धा के साथ, आदर के साथ और एक दोस्त के तौर पर याद करते हैं। और आज मेरे साथ हैं इस समय एंड्रयू व्हाइटहेड। एंड्रयू व्हाइटहेड बीबीसी के दिल्ली ब्यूरो में रहे, लंदन में बीबीसी के सीनियर पोजीशन पे रहे, न्यूज़ रूम को भी हेड किया। एंड्रयू व्हाइटहेड ने दिल्ली ब्यूरो में बीबीसी के काम किया था, तब मार्क टुली वहाँ ब्यूरो चीफ थे। एंड्रयू, आपने बहुत अच्छा लिखा भी है मार्क के बारे में एक अपनी ओबिचुरी में। कैसे याद करते हैं आप मार्क को? हाउ डू यू रिमेंबर हिम?
मार्क मेरा दोस्त था, मेरा अच्छा दोस्त, मेरा पुराना दोस्त था. I remember him with huge respect. He was a very kind, convivial man, very friendly, बहुत दोस्तानी. He was very modest. He had charisma, but he was never arrogant. He loved India. He was clear that he was British, but he was not an expat. He lived 3/4 of his life in India. He was born in India, he died in India. I found him very supportive to me when I was new in Delhi. He encouraged, he was generous, and we used to work, you remember it, Ram Dutt, हमारा दफ्तर निजामुद्दीन में, बहुत छोटा था, एक फ्लोर मार्क और जिली का घर था और दूसरा फ्लोर दफ्तर था. दफ्तर में 1 2 3 4 रूम्स, कमरे में.
और मेरे ख्याल से आपका जो किचन में आपका जो वो रिकॉर्डिंग रूम या स्टूडियो जिसको कहते हैं, मैं एक
such a but it was very small, and there were, you know, the BBC office now is very big. It's got dozens, probably hundreds of people in many different languages. Then there were maybe 5 or 6 people working there. This is mid-90s when I first came to work there. And Mark would often say at the end of a day, Andy, pop downstairs, let's have a beer. And he would open a bottle of Rosy Pelican. He liked this beer, Rosy Pelican from Haryana. Nobody makes it now, but it was his favorite. And that was, he liked to chat, he liked to gossip. There was a personal warmth about him. He cared, and his contacts were with politicians and with opinion formers, but also partly because he spoke excellent Hindi, vastly better than my Hindi. He was also able to talk to villagers and to talk to taxi drivers, to talk to people in the street. So he understood really quite well what ordinary Indians were thinking about social issues, political issues. And that warmth, I think you could hear in his voice and you could hear in his journalism. So I looked at him as I revered him. He was somebody who provided guidance and inspiration.
Yes, you said as a man, what type of person he was? Very simple, modest, courteous, humble. Uh, but what kind of journalism? What was his special about his journalism?
Um, he was never an armchair journalist, so he always tried to get to where the story is. Quite a lot of journalists do their journalism on the phone or now by online. He always wanted to be where the story was. Traveling often by train, he preferred train to plane if he could. It was very vivid. He had got a very good sense of what made a story and how to make a story interesting. He had an eye for the personal detail, the little bit of observation which would bring his report alive. And he had a real feel for news. He wasn't born to be a journalist. His father was a business person in Calcutta. He studied theology at university. He was at one point thinking of becoming a Christian clergyman, a priest. And then when he joined the BBC, he was an office administrator. He wasn't a journalist, but he took to journalism, and he was a great storyteller. And you could tell it in when you were chatting to him, he was always sharing stories. In his journalism, again, he was sharing stories,
He,
different kinds of stories.
he almost painted pictures out of his words.
He did, and I think he would say himself, although he did radio and television, he was probably more comfortable with radio. And using his voice to tell the story. He was always just that slightly bit awkward on television. Radio was what he really excelled in. And this, of course, was at a time when radio had a much bigger reach, certainly in India, than television had. And when BBC radio had a very big reach in English and in Hindi, as you know very well, Ram Dutt, as one
Yes.
of the big people in the BBC Hindi service for many years. So that made
Mm.
him quite renowned. And I was always struck in Delhi when you would talk to people, politicians, about Mark. They didn't regard him as a foreign correspondent. They regarded him as one of their own. So
Mm.
he wasn't Indian, but they saw him as Indian. And I think that was
It's because of trust he created, or
because because
rapport he had with people.
he had a gift, so he had a personal warmth, which meant he made friends easily. I think it was more than that. I think they could straight away tell that he cared about India. He didn't just know about India, he was invested in India. And so I think they responded to that. They understood that he actually wanted to know more about India, but he wanted to know more about India because he cared about India. So it wasn't simply a journalism task, it was something more than that. And I think people responded to that.
एंड आज की दुनिया में जो हम जर्नलिस्ट हैं, वी हैव आफ्टर दिस कम्युनिकेशन रिवोल्यूशन, जस्ट इन आवर हैंड वी हैव internet, we have mobile, we can communicate with anybody anywhere. And what type of facility you people had at that time to transmit news or to collect news?
To say it was a facility would be difficult. So back in those days, हमारे स्टूडियो सिर्फ रेडियो के लिए था, बहुत छोटा, बहुत बेसिक, और टेलेक्स चलता है,
Yes. जी जी.
टेलेक्स, फोन, रेडियो स्टूडियो, और हमारा दफ्तर में BBC का पुराना दफ्तर, on top of the desks there was glass surface on top of the desks. जब मैं लंदन में काम करता था,
तब कंप्यूटर नहीं थे.
computers, yes, very simple computers. So
Yes, yes, because
Initially,
मुझे
no
याद है
internet, internet नहीं था. So computers.
मुझे याद है
Uh,
मार्क ने अपना टाइपराइटर मुझे भेज दिया था जब कंप्यूटर आ गया.
uh, Mark found technology बहुत मुश्किल. He liked typewriter, ठीक. Writing, ठीक. Computer, थोड़ी सी. Or equipment for making your voice stronger. No. He would have somebody. He would need
Just
a little bit of help. So
the
his
Sony
as a
Pro and a Sony Pro recorder, sound
yeah.
recorder,
So
and a
he
type.
Sony Pro recorder. But if he was doing a documentary, he would have a producer working with him, and that was what he was most comfortable doing. So yes, Sony Pro, but with cassette tapes. This is
Mm.
not digital. So with those cassette tapes, and before that, there was a tape recorder, a big tape recorder called a Huha, and
Mm.
that had reel-to-reel tape, and each tape only lasted for about 15 minutes, and the tape recorder was so heavy that your shoulder sagged with the weight of the tape recorder. So Mark would have been used to that, but this was before the internet. Before there were any ways you could not transmit uh, video images, moving images back to London very easily. So that's why he
Mm.
did a lot of radio, and radio was his real strength. But in the
I-
office, there were
I'll just remind you that at that time, Mark and we used to file news dispatches from CTO, Central Telegraph Office. Even 6th December demolition, we worked from the CTO, and there were no the ISD line at home, and we used to have collect call. So very difficult. Even then, how could this be that BBC was ahead of Indian media, even without
well,
tools?
I think the BBC had a large audience. It had a lot of loyalty, so people told the BBC News because they thought the BBC would make use of it and make use of it quickly. There were
Mm.
no satellite cable channels. This was even before Star TV. And Doordarshan and All India Radio had very large audiences, but they were under a level of political control. So that made them slightly slow and nervous to take any stories um, which might embarrass the government. So the BBC did not have those sensitivities. So the BBC had an advantage there. And there are, many instances where people would not believe news until they heard it on the BBC. That was the sign that it really was true. Other organisations might report, but when the BBC reported, then it was believed to be confirmed. This is true. And there are, as you know, there are pictures of Rajiv Gandhi at the airport listening with a radio to his ear, and that was the BBC on shortwave, which he wanted to hear to confirm the news of the death of his mother. So that was a very different time. Uh,
Mm.
the world was very different then. In some ways, much simpler. There was less competition around, and the BBC held a very big place. And Mark, of course, was reporting India to the world and to Britain and to India at the same time. So he was reporting to three audiences: Hindustan, Englistan, और दुनिया.
ओह, तो 3 तरह के ऑडियंस थे उनको जिनके लिए मार्क रिपोर्ट करते थे. बहुत अच्छा आपने बताया. हिंदुस्तान, ब्रिटिश पीपल एंड द होल वर्ल्ड. मार्क ने आपको बातचीत में कभी पहले बताया था कि इमरजेंसी में उनको क्या फेस करना पड़ा था जब इंडिया में इमरजेंसी और सेंसरशिप लगी थी तो?
I heard him talk about the emergency. I don't think he ever talked to me when we were correspondents together, but I heard him
Yes.
talk afterwards. There was a seminar actually in London, and he talked
Hmm.
about the emergency there. Um, I think he had contrasting feelings because being asked to leave the country at 24 hours notice, this was a real shock. He was being expelled from the country of his birth, expelled not for anything that he'd done, just simply for telling the truth and for giving a narrative which was true, but the one that the government didn't want to be heard. On the other hand, I think it also, the fact that he was targeted in that way was evidence that his journalism had an impact. And he wouldn't have been thrown out of India if his journalism didn't matter. So I think it was also demonstration of how important his journalism was. And indeed, although he spent 18 months in London, he was able to come back and to re-establish the BBC. And from then onwards, I mean, he was basically, India was his home throughout the rest of his life. He traveled a great deal. He spent time in London, but India was home from 1977 onwards. So in some ways, it helped to shape his life. But also the fact that he, within the BBC, it also cemented his reputation. Sometimes when, as a journalist, you're a target of measures like that, it demonstrates that you're actually doing your job well, that you're not actually being blown by the political winds, that you're actually determined to tell the truth, and you will report what you believe to be the truth, whatever pressure is brought on you by governments and ministries and politicians. And Mark did that. So it hurt, but I think he was also proud of what he achieved in reporting through those difficult times before he was expelled and once he was allowed back into Delhi.
आपने भी और मार्क टुली ने भी ये काफी डिफिकल्ट टाइम में इंडिया में रिपोर्टिंग करी, खास करके उस समय जब ये राम मंदिर और बाबरी मस्जिद बनाम राम जन्मभूमि का जो मूवमेंट चला और अयोध्या में डिमोलिशन भी हुआ बाबरी मस्जिद का। तो आप लोगों को भी बाद में कभी गवर्नमेंट का प्रेशर या उस तरह का कुछ झेलना पड़ता था? You had to face any pressure from government?
Well, I mean, of course, I only arrived in India a couple of years after the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and you would know better than anybody, Ram Dutt, what happened at Ayodhya that day. And you, I know, were with Mark and heard the crowds who were chanting against the BBC and took refuge and had to be helped to safety after several very perilous hours. I mean, of course, that was not directly government pressure, and although it was difficult getting news out from Ayodhya, he was able to do that.
I'm not talking about that particular incident. I'm talking in your time or when you were in Delhi bureau with Mark. And
no,
what type of interference or not interference was?
There was very little interference from the government. The government understood what the BBC did.
Not like today?
Sorry?
Not like today?
That's for you to say, and I'll let you comment. I'm not going to go there. But yes, there was very little direct interference. And I remember, on occasions, it was possible when there was a big breaking story. I mean, it's amazing to think of it, but you could walk into North Block, South Block, just walk in with a camera crew in tow and knock on doors and see if a minister would talk to you. Without an appointment, sometimes in the evening. You couldn't do that now, and politicians were very accessible. I mean, Mark spoke to politicians of all persuasions. I interviewed Whitehead, Advani, Malkani, all the prominent leaders of the BJP in a way that the BBC does not get to interview Narendra Modi or Amit Shah. Things have changed in that regard. I mean, sometimes in reporting Kashmir, there was a little bit of
annoyance.
There was, I wouldn't say annoyance. There was an attempt to make sure that you were always aware of what the government's line was. And nobody expected BBC journalists simply to follow what the government's line was. But even there, I mean, when I went to Kashmir, as I did on many times in the 1990s, the authorities there, and indeed the Indian Army there, they understood that journalists were wanting to get a range of views. Of course, journalists were going to talk to separatists and talk to people who disagreed with the Indian government, and broadly that was understood, and that was fine. I never got any real grief from that. I mean, there were some minor times when
So
things were uncomfortable.
there was a space to tell the truth, and
Yes, and I think access was good, and
mm,
there was a very strong, and you know this, Ram Dutt, there was a very strong network of BBC correspondents in all the state capitals who were broadcasting themselves, but also providing information which would go to, which would inform Mark Tully's journalism as well. He knew that there were people he could turn to in Lucknow or in Bhopal or in Chandigarh or Mumbai, Kolkata, Patna, who he could ring up to, and journalists who BBC journalists who were absolutely reliable and absolutely on top of the story. And that network was a great thing, a wonderful strength for the BBC and for its audiences. And that was, I think, um, uh, I think that was very important to the BBC's success and to Mark's. And Mark always admitted, he acknowledged very generously the support he got from his colleagues. When Amritsar and the Golden Temple, he was working with Satish Jacob. At Ayodhya, he was working with you. And when he travelled, there were BBC journalists who were often helping, advising, and informing him, and that was a very important part of his success.
would you like to talk about why ultimately Mark had to leave BBC? What kind of differences he had with the management, the director
Yeah.
general at that time?
So there was a sort of a new leadership of the BBC in London, and there was a new director general in the mid-90s called John Burt, and he had different ideas of running the organisation, and he wanted to be on more managerial lines, and there was a sort of complete reorganisation, top to bottom. And as I remember, I think I'm right in saying another journalist was brought in from London who took the title of head of bureau in Delhi, which had been Mark's job, and Mark became South Asia correspondent. And the argument was that would free up Mark to do more reporting, and somebody else would do the bureau management side of things. But I think Mark was disappointed by that, and I think he was also unhappy about some of the changes happening in the BBC. And at a conference in England, which he went back to speak at, he said he described the new director general of the BBC as a Dalek, which was a sort of a Dalek was a figure from Doctor Who. They were sort of rather monstrous tyrants of figures, and he said that John Burt was running the BBC based on fear.
Yeah, that was his headline of his speech he gave at Birmingham Radio Academy Festival.
That's right, and I don't think he expected it to make so much attention, but it made front page news because Mark Tully was a very famous correspondent in Britain, of course, as well as in India, and this was
BBC also reported his speech very extensively at that time.
It did, because I mean the BBC reports the BBC as well and tries to do that fairly. So I think Mark thought that you could actually, as a BBC reporter, you could be very wounding about the head of the BBC and life would continue as normal, but it didn't. And I think there was a lot of pressure on Mark to leave the BBC, and in the end he resigned. He wasn't sacked, he resigned. He chose to leave. But it was a bit of a wrench. He was only 59 years old. He had still, lots of journalism to do. He went on to continue broadcasting as a freelance. He had a weekly program on Radio 4 in the UK about faith, actually. And he did other things. He made some TV series and TV programs, but he was no longer the main BBC correspondent in Delhi. And I think it took him a lot of time to get used to that. But of course, once he'd left the BBC, he stayed in Delhi. He stayed in Delhi for the rest of his life. He didn't retire back to England. Delhi was his home.
So I think the current generation would not have chance to listen Mark's report, but I think they have got this news, so now they know such a great man, such a great journalist. What do you think young journalists, journalists of this generation can learn from him?
First of all, be humble. However famous you become, you remember that journalism is not about you, it's about the people whose lives you are reporting on. I think that's one very big thing. And secondly, go to the story. Go to as close to where the story is happening as you can. Don't be tempted to do it from a distance. Your journalism will always be better if you go to where the story is happening rather than rely on secondhand digital forms of information. And third is be kind. Have a kind demeanor, because your personal warmth will come across in your reporting. And I think that was Mark's style of broadcasting was very much his own. He was idiosyncratic. It wasn't what you would call the textbook way of doing things, but his warmth and his personality, as well as the quality of his reporting, came through. And that's why he had such a big impact on his audience. I mean, I can't think of another BBC correspondent who was revered in the way that Mark was. Lots of good correspondents, some great correspondents, but none that quite had the authority and the impact and the reach and the name recognition that Mark Tully deservedly achieved.
Thank you very much, Andrew Whitehead, for giving your time and talking about Mark Tully.
And thank you, Ram Dutt, for inviting me. And I'm sorry I didn't speak too much in Hindi, but my Hindi was never good, and it's got worse over the years. So it would have been a bit of a difficulty.
Don't mind, now people, I think, understand English better than previous times. So people understand what you want to say. And thank you very much again.
Thanks, Ram Dutt.